Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I am your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. How's it going? What are we getting into today?
Well, today we're going to talk about a pretty old story, and it has to do with a nun, and of course, if we're talking about it, a murder. So, let's get into it. This is Season 5, Episode 19, Sister Mary Janina. When John and Josephine Misek immigrated to the United States from Bohemia, a former country of present-day Czech Republic, with their children and settled in Chicago, they probably had big dreams of a bigger and better life than what they were leaving behind. A fresh start, a new beginning. So much promise ahead. Little did they know that their third child would become the unwilling lead player in a murder mystery involving the Catholic Church, a cover-up, and a forbidden romance that still has Michigan talking over 100 years after the event. When the family arrived in America, John would become a stonesman and Josephine a homemaker. They would settle in the thriving Bohemian community at 221 Bunker Street in Chicago to start anew and raise their family. There had been a huge influx of immigrants from Bohemia, and they had settled here and in the Michigan's Pinky, the area near Traverse City. Now, this is on the west side of the Mitten, and the Pinky is also known as the Leelanau Peninsula, which is also wine country. The 1880 Chicago census showed they had 4 children: Joseph, Frank, Josephina, and Emmanuel. According to the census, Joseph was a carpenter and Frank, at only 13, was a type maker. This probably means he set the letters for newspapers to ready them for printing. Josephina and Emmanuel were students. John would be killed by a police officer in 1883 over a dispute at a church dance. Joseph would die in 1890. Shortly after her husband's murder, Josephine would end up in the Eastern State Asylum for the Insane in Kankakee, where she would die in 1902. Whatever dreams they had for their children, they wouldn't live to see realized, and Josephina was on her way to become a part of Michigan lore. Sophia Camille Truskowska was a young lady of privilege living in Warsaw, Poland in the mid-1800s. Surrounded by wealth, she would see and be moved by how those less fortunate were treated. A devout Catholic, she would take her vows to become a nun, and in 1855, she would find the Felician Sisters, a group of nuns dedicated to serving women and children in need. In 1874, they would bring their mission to the United States, settling in Wisconsin, and in 1882, they would move their mother house, or central headquarters, to what is present-day Livonia, but was then a part of Detroit. It is to this mother house that Josephina would be sent at age 9 to be raised by the nuns. Now, I'm saying it's probably Josephina, so I apologize for that. I'm going to slip in and out of that, just saying. I'll do my best. From all reports, Josephina was a happy child. She loved to sing and play the piano. She was vivacious, outgoing, and energetic. She loved nature and would take many long walks in the woods. She would be raised in the mother house with the nuns and go on to take the holy vows herself at the age of 18. Upon taking her vows, she would take the name Sister Mary Janina. In 1906, she would be sent by the nuns to the town of Isadore, located near current-day Lake Leelanau. Isadore was home to a wooden Catholic church called the Holy Rosary that had been built in 1883 and was served by the Felician nuns. A large farming community, the original name was Four Corners, but it was later changed to Isadore to honor the patron saint of farmers. The town would establish a post office in 1892 and the Holy Rosary Catholic School in 1905, which was a 3-story brick schoolhouse smack dab in the center of town. A jailhouse was also built, and that was most of the town. Today, it is deemed a ghost town, with only the church, the school, the jailhouse, and a few scattered houses, the rectory, and the cemetery remaining. In August of 1906, Sister Janina came to Isadore as Mother Superior and to help 2 other nuns teach at the school. She had taught at the school in Detroit for a number of years and had experience with students. There were approximately 200 students, many of Polish or Bohemian descent, enrolled at the school at the time. In addition to Sister Janina, there were 7 other people living on the church grounds. Father Andrew Banowski, who was 33 years old, his young sister Susan, and Stanislawa Lipinska, who I will now refer to as Stella, who was the rectory housekeeper, Stella's daughter Mary, 2 other nuns, Sister Angelina and Josephine, and a chore boy named Gruba. Father Banowski was known for being stern and for his unusual animals that he housed, such as a parrot, a badger, 2 crocodiles, also reported as alligators, and several foxes. He was a slender man with slicked back hair and piercing eyes. He was ordained in 1897. He was a young priest, as Janina was a young nun. During the winter, due to travel constraints, most of the students would board at the school. The 3 nuns were in charge of feeding, clothing, and educating the young people. There was little time for themselves except for moments after classes let out and chores were done for the day. Then they would retire to their rooms on the 2nd story of the school to nap and relax. It was a quiet and simple life. At the end of the school year, the students would return home and the nuns would return to Livonia. But the year of 1907 would be different. That year, the nuns decided to stay in Isadore. All 3 of the nuns suffered from tuberculosis, and it was believed that the country air would ease their symptoms. Sister Janina was fond of long walks in the woods, and what better place to take walks and commune with God than in Isadore? And so, the nuns settled into their summer routine: prayers, gardening, visiting with each other, daily chores, and daily naps. Church on Sunday. Life had a rhythm. However, all was not well at the school. Someone was watching the nuns, and someone did not approve of the behavior of Sister Janina. That someone was Stella. She didn't approve of the local doctor, Dr. Freilich, treating her tuberculosis alone in her bedroom. She didn't approve of Father Andrew calling on her alone in her bedroom to discuss church matters when she was too ill to come downstairs. It was not allowed for a nun to be alone with a man, especially in her bedroom. In her mind, she believed that Dr. Freilich spent more time alone with Sister Janina than her condition warranted. Stella would call Sister Janina a whore and a slut to one of the farmer's wives. She thought Sister Janina sang too much, was too vivacious, and wasn't reserved enough to be the sister superior. She thought that she spent too much time with Father Andrew, and she let her feelings be known to anyone in the parish that would listen. Her words would come back to haunt her. As the summer began to wane and the month of August started, news came that Bishop Richter from Grand Rapids was coming to bless the school. It was a busy and exciting time for the three nuns. There was so much to do in addition to regular chores. The school had to be prepared, and everything must be perfect for the bishop's visit. At the time of our story, every day had a different chore assigned to it. There was a saying that went, wash on Monday, iron on Tuesday, mend on Wednesday, churn on Thursday, clean on Friday, bake on Saturday, and rest on Sunday. Different areas would have different things assigned to different days, but it was a schedule women would use to organize their week. Friday, August 23rd, was baking day in Isadore. Father Andrew, his sister Susan, and Gruba decided it would be a good day to go fishing at what is present-day Lake Leelanau, then named Carp Lake. The father and his entourage set off in their wagon, fishing poles loaded, while the nuns stayed behind to ready the school for students and the bishop's visit while getting their baking done. As the fishing group left, they saw Sister Janina drawing the shades to her room for her afternoon nap. It would be the last time anyone would admit to seeing her. It was a quiet day with Stella busy around the rectory and her daughter Mary sewing in the back room. Insects buzzed in the fields and birds sang in the trees. Perhaps sounds came across the fields from nearby farmhouses. Horses may have been neighing in the distance. There was nothing to indicate the events that would take place. Sister Angelina and Sister Josephine awoke from their nap at about 3:30 and went to find Sister Janina. Before their naps, Sister Janina had stated that she had to go to the church basement to retrieve paper flowers stored there so they could decorate the school for the upcoming visit by the bishop. At first, when they couldn't find her, they weren't concerned. Perhaps the sister had issues finding the flowers and her nap had started later than theirs. She was known to go for walks and lose track of time. But then they found her open prayer book and her rosary on the windowsill and the back door of the school ajar. As the door was never kept unlocked and certainly never kept open, this concerned the two sisters. A nun is never without her prayer book and rosary. When questioned, Stella and Mary denied having seen the missing nun, and when Father Andrew returned at approximately 8 p.m., it was decided to start a search. Neighbors were called, lanterns were lit, and the school and church grounds were gone over with a fine-tooth comb. Basements, attics, and rooms were searched. Nothing. It was known that Sister Janina liked long walks in the woods, so the search would eventually lead to the woods and surrounding swamps. But no sign of the nun would be found. Monday morning, the local paper, the Traverse City Record-Eagle, would speculate that an unknown man who had fallen in love with the plain and friendly nun had kidnapped her in a fit of passion. Some people claimed to have seen a strange buggy near the rectory the day she disappeared. Some said she had voluntarily given up on her vows and run off with a man. Some said she was pregnant and ran away to avoid the shame. Some thought she had fallen into the swamp and died. Some said the local town drunk murdered her. Theories and rumors ran rife, but facts were few. A single woman named Frances Cox from Boston would be held for suspicion of being the missing nun, and Father Andrew would be forced to come forward and state she was not. It wasn't until the following Thursday that the local sheriff, Sheriff Martin Brown, would be notified and an official police investigation would begin. But by then, the crime scene had been compromised and there were no clues remaining. Too many people had been in and around the crime scene. Items had been moved and cleaned. Any footsteps near the building had been walked over. Nothing was as it had been on Friday. But then, 9 days after the disappearance, the footprints of a woman were found in the swamp. Some appeared to be old, some new. Some brown fabric, supposedly the same cloth as a nun's habit was made from, was found on barbed wire fencing along the road. 3 days after the disappearance, a farmer reported hearing singing coming from the swamp and seeing a light flickering among the trees. Men were posted near the swamp at night to see if they could also hear the singing. They did hear it, but were too superstitious to follow the sound. A woman would report seeing a nun walking at night in the swamp, carrying a candle and singing Sister Janina's favorite hymn. She didn't approach the nun because the flame on her candle was too steady and strong to be real. It didn't flicker at all in the breeze. The Sunday after she disappeared, 400 people would turn up to do a search, but to no avail. Father Andrew would offer a $500 reward, hire a private investigator and a bloodhound. He would pay for it all with his own money. The dog he hired was a local legend for its ability to find lost, missing, or hiding people. The dog followed a scent into a cornfield, through a swamp, across a road, down a dirt road near where the piece of supposed habit was found, to a second dirt road where the scent vanished. No matter how they tried, they just could not find her. A clairvoyant stated that Sister Janina was being kept at a house on Glen Lake in nearby Empire against her will. The Empire police would find the house the clairvoyant described, search it, and find nothing. A letter postmarked Chicago would arrive at the church and state, quote, Sister Mary Janina, who disappeared from the convent, was not abducted or murdered. She was simply tired of her job and slipped quietly away, knowing it was the only method that would be successful. You are foolish to raise this hue and cry. It was a mistake, I presume you now realize, and so, for appearance's sake, give out to the public that she was abducted? Nonsense. Leave her alone. Give her a chance. You probably won't find her, and she doesn't want that you should. And that was signed a Protestant pup. But the letter ultimately wasn't helpful either. 2 months after the disappearance, a nun would go into the basement and see something glinting in the sunlight coming in through the small door. They were glasses, believed to have belonged to Sister Janina. But how? With all the searching that had gone on, could they have been missed all these months ago? And if they weren't Sister Janina's, who did they belong to? Gruba slept in the basement. How did he not see them prior to this? The discovery would add another layer of mystery. As it always does, life in the little parish moved on. Students would come and go from the school. Graduations, funerals, and weddings would be held. Children would be born. Crops would be planted and harvested. Seasons would change, but nobody would hear from Sister Janina. One rumor that persisted was that Sister Janina was pregnant when she disappeared and Father Andrew was the baby's father. His reputation in tatters, Father Andrew would be transferred to the parish in Menace in 1913. Susan would accompany him. He would eventually be replaced by Father Palaskiewski. Mary would get married in 1910 to Joseph Fliss, and they and Stella would move to Milwaukee, where Joseph had his family. Later, Stella would move to Menace and become housekeeper again for Father Andrew. Some reports say sisters Angelina and Josephine would die from their tuberculosis. Others would say that they moved for fear of being next to be murdered. Gruba would move to Canada and disappear. In just a few short years, all the people that had lived at the rectory at the time of the disappearance were gone. Although cold, the case was still open, and the sheriff welcomed all information on the case.
I still don't understand. The first thing I would do when somebody says, don't go look for them, is probably go look for them.
Right. Smoke and mirrors, right?
Yeah, this whole thing sounds super hinky.
Yeah, it does. There's a reason for that. I mean, and as we all know from all the Catholic bullshit with altarways and all that, what does the Catholic Church do? They cover. They move. Move this person over here. Don't look over there.
I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I don't want to say too much, even though, I'm very universal-minded now, spiritual, as they say. But yeah, it's a little bit shady.
Mm-hmm.
A lot bit shady.
A lot of it.
Ugh.
No.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I can't even get past that. But okay, keep going.
Here we go. Father Edward Kozlowski had been a priest in Michigan prior to becoming the auxiliary bishop of Milwaukee in 1914. Edward Kozlowski had information about the case. Before his death in 1915, he shared his information with other church officials, but not law enforcement. This was in direct violation of civil law of the state of Michigan and the canon laws of the Catholic Church. He knew where the remains were, and he knew who had placed them there. 4 years previous, someone had come to the confessional, to Father Nowak, who had then come to him. Someone had said to Father Nowak, quote, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." The years went on, and soon it was 1918. Father Podlaskiewski, God, I hope I'm saying that right, had a project in mind. The wooden church, which had served the community for years, was getting old, and he wanted to replace it with something more modern and stylish. He had special ordered 13 stained glass windows from Germany, which were waiting to be shipped. World War I had just ended, and shipping was difficult. But he had big plans for his new church. It would be a showplace. But before he began construction on the church, someone, rumored to be Father Edward or possibly Father Lemke from Detroit, told him to check the basement for bones. He was told he would find the body of the missing nun and that she had been murdered by a woman. He was warned to move the bones under cover of darkness to the cemetery and keep his mouth shut. There must be no scandal. As the basement had been searched multiple times at the time of the disappearance, Father Podlaskiewski was confused. If the bones were there, shouldn't they have been found in the initial search? But in the fall of 1918, he and Jacob Fliss, the church sexton, had gone to the basement under the cover of darkness with a potato fork and lanterns and began to dig. To their amazement, they found the bones of a woman and child in a shallow grave under a pile of wood. Bits and pieces of brown fabric were found with the body. A special ring of silver and steel design was also found. All nuns would receive a special ring at the time they took their vows. They would wear the rings for the rest of their lives and eventually be buried with it on. This would leave him to believe it was the missing nun. Keeping in mind what he had been told, the two moved the bones into a wooden crate and then the cemetery, where it was buried under a giant cross. As they kept their mouths shut, for a few months anyway, 18-year-old Martha Miller had replaced Stella as the rectory cleaner and lived on a farm nearby with her parents. Unmarried, Martha had a problem. This young girl was pregnant and refused to name the father. It was the tail end of 1918, and things like this just didn't happen to nice girls. It was a shame and embarrassment to the family. Someone had to be held accountable. No matter how much they begged and pleaded, she would not tell who the father of the child was. Father Paliszewski was summoned to see if she would confess to him, but she wouldn't confess. She did agree, however, to allow Father Paliszewski to take her to St. Joseph's Hospital in Ann Arbor to give birth and place the baby up for adoption. He would bring her there, and 6 weeks later, in approximately January 1919, he would go and fetch her back. On the way home, the two would begin to talk. They would talk in an intimate way about intimate things, the way lovers do. Martha had no reason to confess to Father Paliszewski all those months ago who her baby's father was, for they both knew it was him. When Martha brought up the missing nun, Father Paliszewski would confide in her about his discovery in the rectory basement and his subsequent actions. Upon her return home, Martha would tell her father about the baby's parentage and what he had admitted on the long trip home. Her father would immediately contact the new sheriff, Sheriff Knukin, and the scandal that the father had tried to avoid would become front-page news all over the country. Father Paliszewski would never see his church built. He would be sent to St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit to be put on trial by the Catholic Church. He would then be sent to Kentucky and Ohio to serve congregations there as his punishment. He would also be brought back to testify about his actions at the trial. After the trial, he would fade into obscurity, disappearing from church records. The sheriff obtained a warrant and arrested Father Andrew and Stella in Menace. It was determined that while he may have been the father of the baby, Father Andrew could not have killed Sister Janina, as he had witnesses that he was fishing at Carp Lake and he was released. However, Stella's abrasive personality and clearly remembered hatred of the young nun would make her the number one suspect. She also had no real alibi for that August day in 1907. Her story had changed. In 1907, she would say she was busy in the rectory. When arrested, she would state she spent the day working in the garden. The jailhouse, though small, had to be terrifying for Stella. She would claim the sheriff brought her into a dark cell, and on a table were the bones of Sister Janina. The room, lit only by candles at the skeleton's head and feet, would have spooked the superstitious Stella. But when the bones said, quote, "You killed me! You killed me!" and the jawbones moved, she probably almost lost her mind. I know I would have. She would claim at the trial that she was knocked out on the head with a ladle and later awoke in a box with the bones. She would say she was plied with alcohol by the staff, although it was in the middle of Prohibition. She would state she was beaten by the sheriff, but still, she wouldn't confess. As he couldn't get Stella to confess, Sheriff Knukin hired a female detective that spoke Polish, Mary Tylika, to go undercover in the hopes of gaining Stella's trust and of getting a confession. Faking her arrest, Mary would be placed in the cell with Stella. She would spend 6 days with Stella, and it worked. Stella talked. Stella told her, quote, "First, I stunned her. Then, I went out to the garden and got a spade. I dug a hole under the church, dragged the body to the hole, and put it in. As I was trying to cover the head, it would always rise up. I threw 2 or 3 shovels of dirt on the head, but each time it rose up. Then I took the backside of the spade and knocked the sister 3 times on the head with all my might. Stella's attorneys would arrive at the courthouse on May 4th, 1919. Denied admittance to the client as the sheriff and judge were out of town. All they could do was watch Stella through the bars on the jail. Stella was rolling on the ground, crutching her rosary and making inhuman noises. It was as if she had gone insane with what had been done to her. The trial would be delayed while she was sent to Ann Arbor for a psychiatric examination, which would determine that she was faking her insanity. She was found fit to stand trial.
Okay, can I just say for a minute, back in those days, may sound valid, I'm struck with the idea that this girl has been framed the whole time. And that it was the priests that killed the other woman because she was going to rat on them that they impregnated her. And they're framing this young girl. And they're literally sealing her coffin, right? Putting the nail in her coffin with an entrapped so-called confession that is literally just hearsay.
I don't disagree with you. Protect the church.
Yeah, I feel like, and that's why this girl's going insane. Because she literally cannot defend herself at all. I don't know. Feeling like this is fake facts. I'm feeling like this is contrived. I don't know why. That's just my vibe. My vibe on this is everything that they have written down about this story is fiction.
Well, and think about the time period, too.
Yeah. Yeah, they're railroading this poor girl.
Mm-hmm.
Driving her insane and then saying she's not insane.
These stories run real deep in multiple different areas of the time.
Yeah, it's just too coinky-dinky, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That a nun that was impregnated was killed and murdered. And then another nun that, oh, by the way, was also impregnated, but she was gullible enough where they told her to keep quiet, and she did keep quiet about the father, and they let her have the baby, but, oh, by the way, they made her give it up. And then that in and of itself was probably enough to drive her insane, you know, on the brink of insanity at least. And then they railroad her and pin the other murder on her.
Yeah, and the young girl, I don't think she was a nun. She was just a young girl that went to the school. Men will be men.
Yeah,
I don't care what color you're wearing. You still have the hormones. You're still a man.
It's still the same kind of story, even if she wasn't a nun. A priest knocked her up, and then she stayed quiet, so she stayed alive. But they still made her give up her baby.
Mm-hmm.
And she probably lost it from giving birth and then walking away without probably even seeing her baby. Because from what I hear, that's how it used to go in those nunnery mom camps, basically.
Yeah.
They were unwed mothers. It was like a breeding farm almost. Don't even get me started on that crap. I'm too feminist to have that conversation without getting mad.
Right.
But,
and up until that point, she stayed quiet. So they're like, oh, yeah she's doing what she's supposed to do.
Yeah, she stayed quiet until she was completely distraught because she gave birth to a baby and never seen it probably. So she's probably going insane at that knowledge. So she shared, like, well, this is what really went down.
Yeah.
And as soon as she said what really went down, they were like, oh, guess what we're going to do to you?
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing is complete BS from the word go. And the unfortunate thing is now this is what the history says about her.
Yeah.
Which I believe is complete fabrication to save the skin of one of the priests.
I couldn't agree more.
Oh, God, gross.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's get back to the trial. So the trial will begin on July 29th, 1919. The 100-seat courtroom was packed tight. Reporters from as far away as Chicago, Missouri, Oregon, and Grand Rapids were in attendance. The air was electric with anticipation. Wrapped and riveted, they would listen in stunned silence as the prosecutor painted Stella as a widowed single mother that was bitter, hateful, and jealous of the much-loved nun, and how in a fit of jealous rage she killed her, hid the body, then moved it to the basement. Her daughter Mary would testify, sobbing throughout the entire trial. Parishioners attested to the relationship with Stella and Sister Janina. Mary Gatsky would testify that Stella often stopped by her house for coffee and that Stella had told her sister Janina was a slut. She would infer that Father Andrew had been having relationships with all three nuns, according to Stella. Mrs. Jacob Flees would testify that the day Sister Janina disappeared, Stella would tell her, quote, Sister Janina was such a light character that she let Father Banowski and the doctor into her cell, which was her bedroom, and they were not allowed to do this, even upon their dying bed. Others would state all three nuns were afraid of Stella. Parents would state their children were terrified of her. But it was the testimony of Mary Tylika that would clinch the case. Not only would she testify to what Stella said about the murder, but also that Stella had told her she had confessed to Father Nowak in Milwaukee in 1914. Father Nowak had then gone to Bishop Kozlowski to see if he could give absolution. She claimed Stella had told her that she believed once she received absolution from the church, the state could not prosecute her. Stella, taking the stand in her own defense, would deny it all. The defense attorney would try to counter that Dr. Freilich spent time alone with Sister Janina and, finding her pregnant, would perform an abortion that went wrong. She died from the botched abortion. He buried her on his farm and had a handyman move her body to the basement later. Handwriting experts stated that Dr. Freilich had written the letter that was signed, quote, a Protestant pup. The letter would imply that he was guilty of the murder, no matter the cause, but the judge refused to allow the letter or accusations against the doctor into evidence, and the jury never heard this evidence of Stella's probable innocence. The jury was also not allowed to know Sister Janina was pregnant. Both pieces of information could have changed the outcome of the trial, no doubt. Dr. Freilich and another doctor, Dr. Slepika from Sutton's Bay, would testify that the cause of death was the shattered skull. However, a pathologist from Chicago, Dr. Ludwig Hechtwin, would state the fractures happened after death, perhaps when it was dug up and moved. A Dr. McCotter would discredit Dr. Hechtwin and his opinion and side with the two doctors from Michigan. The bones were disinterred again, brought to the courtroom and laid out on the table. The nuns would have to ask to have a moment with the bones, as she had never received a proper Catholic funeral. The judge granted permission, and the nuns gathered around the table and recited prayers over the bones in front of the jurors. This would give the impression that the bones did indeed belong to Sister Janina to the jury, and even though it had never been proven the bones found in the basement were actually hers. After 10 hours of deliberation, Stella would be found guilty of murder in the first degree and be sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor at the Detroit Institute of Corrections. Michigan Supreme Court would review the case in 1920 and uphold the original decision. Father Andrew, believing in her innocence, would support Stella in numerous appeals. In 1927, he would appeal to outgoing Missioner Governor Alec Grossbeck to release her. Governor Grossbeck would parole Stella. She would move to Milwaukee and eventually become a cook for the Felician Order of Nuns located there. She would die in 1961 at the age of 92. Father Andrew would die in 1964 in Mackinac City at the age of 89. Mary Miller would never marry and would die in 1922 at the age of 21, never learning what happened to her son she gave up. The new church would be completed in 1922. It still stands today in the little town. It would be blessed in 1923 by Bishop Kelly. The new church contains the 13 stained glass windows ordered by Father Palaskewski. After the trial, the bones went missing and are still missing today. It is rumored they are buried in Detroit, but it is also rumored she is in the Isadore Cemetery, where she does have a headstone. But this is not the end of the story. In 1979, more than 60 years after the trial and conviction, a Polish attorney from Detroit would renew interest in the case. Under the pen name Natsolum, his last name spelled backwards, Milestan, he would publish a book called, quote, The Errant Nun. In the book, he would cast doubt upon the guilt of Stella. According to him, the Catholic Church denies that Father Andrew was the father of Janina's baby. They claim to know who the father was, but due to confession confidentiality rules, they refuse to release the information. He also believed that Father Andrew was not the baby's father. His theory is that the botched abortion evidence the defense wanted to present is in fact true. Rumor has it that there are secret papers in Isadore with the truth, but the townspeople still guard them to this day. In 1962, Milan Stitt would hear a version of the story from his wife, Allie, who grew up near Isadore. He would write a play based upon her recollections called, quote, The Runner Stumbles, written as a fictional account. The play would be produced on Broadway in 1976. It would be produced in Mexico under the name, quote, Love and Crime in the House of God. In Germany, under the name, quote, Privileged Communication, and in Spain as, quote, Beyond Love. It would also be produced in Japan. Dick Van Dyke would star in a made-for-TV about the murder in 1979 called The Runner Stumbles. He would play the part of the priest living in a small town who falls in love with a nun and then is charged with her murder. Now, this is all based on the play. Although Stella was convicted, questions remain unanswered over 100 years later. Who was the father of the baby? Father Andrew or the doctor? Each had ample opportunity to be the father if Stella spoke the truth. If Stella did commit the murder, where did she hide the body? She was a tiny woman. How did she move a dead body with no help in the middle of the day and people all around her? If it had been in a shallow grave at the time of the initial disappearance, it should have been found. Also, if it was in the grave, why didn't Gruba smell it as it decomposed? It was August. It was hot. It would have stank. He slept in the basement, that is Gruba, near to where the body was eventually found. If Stella really did confess to Father Nowak in Milwaukee, why did both men decide to tell others and violate church rules? Newspapers of the time report that the Mother Superior of the church knew in 1914, and so did many of the nuns. All claim to have been told by the two men. According to, quote, the Menace, a newspaper from Aurora, Missouri, Saturday, November 1, 1919 edition, a sister Innocenta had met Stella when they both served in Menace. She claimed Stella had told her the wrong shoes had been given to the dogs to get a scent in 1907, which would account for the legendary hound dog's inability to find her. Why would that be done? According to testimony, Father Andrew gave the dogs the shoes. Why would he pay for a tracking dog only to give the dog the wrong scent to follow? According to the same paper, retired Sheriff Brown would testify that the day he went to the church, he had found a fire had occurred in the church basement, and there were piles of wood, but he didn't investigate it further except to look around. Was the fire set to offset the smell of the decomposition? And her body was really there all the time. Why didn't he think it was suspicious? Who would have lit a fire in a church basement? Why wouldn't he move the wood? While Father Kozlowski was dead, Father Nowak was still alive. He was never called to testify as to what was told to him that day in Milwaukee. Why? The prosecution, if he was telling the truth, would have had evidence to back the confessional claim that led to the bones. The defense would have had evidence back to Stella's claim that the confession never happened if it was found he lied. Did Father Andrew have Stella commit the murder for him, offering to protect her if she did? Why would he spend so much time and money trying to free her otherwise? The prosecution would even imply that Stella, while she did commit the murder, did so upon orders from someone else. The Atlanta Semi-Weekly Journal would report in 1919 that Father Andrew went to Chicago shortly after the disappearance in 1907 to search for Sister Janina. When he returned, he said that he had seen her there and she was fine. Why would he do this if true? Why was the pregnancy and letter not allowed in court? Knowing the defense had evidence that pointed to Dr. Freilich as a suspect, why did the judge allow him to testify for the prosecution? There were 3 other doctors that testified. His testimony wasn't needed. It would have been in his own best interest to point the jury away from him. Personally, I am not sure Stella was guilty, or if she worked alone. There's just too many unanswered questions. Things I found out after the story was written that are interesting and not in contemporary versions of the story that was found. Now, this is from our researcher and writer, Becky Hiers. Mary and Jacob Flitch would have one daughter, Estelle. Estelle would marry Stanley Bambanek. Stanley was the uncle of Lori Bambanek, a convicted murderess in Wisconsin. Lori was convicted of the murder of Christine Schultz, the ex-wife of Lori's then-husband. The movie Run, Bambi, Run would be made about her crime. This would make Estelle the granddaughter and aunt of 2 convicted female murderers. While most contemporary reports on the murder state the Mary Miller had the blessing of her parents to go to Ann Arbor to have her baby in secret, the October 25th, 1919 edition of the Menace from Aurora, Missouri, would report that she was taken against her will and her parents had no idea what happened to her. The paper also reported that she was threatened to keep their secret by Father Podlaskewski, lest the same thing happened to her that happened to Sister Janina. When she returned home after giving birth, her parents relentlessly questioned her where she had been and why she had left with no word. At that time, she confessed her pregnancy and the father's involvement and what he had told her on the way home about finding the body. So which story is true? That her parents knew she was pregnant and willingly sent her away? Or that she was taken without their knowledge and consent? Or was that just sensationalized media of the day? The paper also states that Father Podlaskewski was arrested, but the Detroit diocese got him released for their own trial. The Washington Post on Monday, March 3rd, 1919, would report that Sister Janina had served in Baltimore for a time as a teacher at a Catholic school there. She was recalled as beautiful, although in the contemporary reports, she is described as plain. According to the article in 1900, as a teacher in Baltimore, her best friend was another teacher, Sister Mary Blanca. Both women would become involved in scandal. What exactly Sister Janina's scandal was is not mentioned, but the papers state she was transferred to a school in New Jersey. It did say, however, that it involved a man. Sister Mary Blanca, however, did have her scandal broadcast in the paper. She would leave the school and her vows and marry a man she had been involved with. The two would move to the Detroit area. The paper claims that Sister Blanca sent Sister Janina a letter asking her to come to Michigan, which is how she ended up at Isadore in 1906. So, did she have an affair in Baltimore? If she did, is it beyond the realm of belief that she had another in Isadore with Father Andrew or the doctor? The Menace would also report this story in March of 1919, but state they believe that Sister Blanca was hiding Sister Janina, or that perhaps both nuns had been murdered and the story of marriage was a cover-up. It was stated authorities searched for Sister Blanca to testify at the trial, but she was never found. Contemporary stories report Janina came to Detroit at the age of 9 as an orphan. She was born in 1873 or 1874, so that would have her in Detroit around 1883 at the time her father died. However, being that her mother was alive until 1902, she would not have been an orphan at the time she arrived in 1883. She would have been 28 at the time of her mother's death, too old to be labeled an orphan. Some reports Becky found state that she was already in Detroit attending school when her father was murdered and her mother was committed. For years after her death, locals would report that they would light candles in Sister Janina's memory at the church. The candles would go out no matter how often they relit them. After her bodies were found, the candles would stay lit. Huh.
Oh, ended it with a little spookiness.
Mm-hmm. Quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, but I don't believe any of it. I think it's all malarkey. I think that these poor women were objectified, used and abused, and then scapegoated.
For all the misdeeds
Yeah, gross.
of men. Yep.
Gross, gross, gross. This whole story was gross because I don't believe that these women were anything but victims. And I know that makes me sound like I'm just jumping on their side because they're women. I mean, I know it's going to come off like that, but I don't know. I just feel like there's too much hanky-panky. There's too much going on. I mean, and these were young women that were nuns, so they were very staunch in their beliefs, I'm sure. To become a nun, you need to. And I think that they were preyed on, using that against themselves.
I absolutely agree. Catholicism, I mean, if you weren't Catholic and if you didn't devote your life and hold these men up on a godly level.
Yeah, the whole thing was prime for abuse.
It absolutely was.
Absolutely took place.
Mm-hmm.
And then the whole scapegoating this poor child for murder, and then the other woman dying, and then the other woman giving up her care. I mean, it's just too much. And the men involved are a priest and a doctor, which even in today's standards, they're held to some higher level for some reason. But back in those days, they were even more impressive. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They were believed tenfold over other men. Forget about over women.
Right. And
the women's voices weren't even heard. Forget about respected.
Right.
This whole story just made me feel sick.
Yeah, and the diocese was quite powerful. And it still is today.
Yeah, it still is. It's crazy.
Yep.
I totally believe that she died from a botched abortion. And the skull fractures were from them moving her bones all the damn time. And you're gonna try and tell me that a petite girl was digging graves and moving these bones around all over the place? Come on, get out of here. It doesn't seem possible at all.
Yeah, there's a lot of players in this. And who's to say Gruba wasn't in on it?
Yeah, I'm sure they all were. The little powerful circle of men, they made their story up, and then they had all the nuns do their bidding. All the nuns that talked trash and all of that. The whole thing is just fiction.
Protect the church at all costs.
Yeah, gross.
Yeah.
I don't like this one either.
Yeah, it's something, all right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening as always. And listen, get on YouTube, like and subscribe. We need ya. So have a great week, everyone. And we will see you back on Wednesday. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.